In the autumn of 1519, a small band of foreign soldiers stood at the edge of a causeway and looked upon a city that should not have been possible. Rising from the middle of a lake, connected to the shore by narrow roads of packed earth and stone, was a metropolis larger than any city in Europe. Its temples caught the morning light. Its canals moved with canoes carrying flowers, maize, and cotton. Its population outnumbered London and Paris combined. The Spanish who saw it that day would later say they wondered if they were dreaming. Within 2 years, that city would be rubble, and the empire that built it would exist only in memory, in a handful of surviving books, and in the ground beneath modern Mexico City. This is the story of how the Aztecs built one of the most sophisticated civilizations the world had ever seen, and how it was destroyed in less time than it takes a child to grow into an adult. To understand the fall, we have to understand the rise. And the rise begins not with triumph, but with humiliation. The people who would become the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica. According to their own oral tradition, recorded generations later by Spanish friars and indigenous scribes, they arrived in the Valley of Mexico sometime in the 13th century as a wandering, unwelcome tribe. They were latecomers to a region already dominated by older, more established city-states. Historians debate exactly where the Mexica originated. Their legends point to a mythical homeland called Aztlan, somewhere to the north or west, but its precise location, or whether it was even a real single place, remains unresolved among scholars. What is better documented is what happened once they reached the valley. They were pushed from territory to territory, forced in a marginal land, and at times reduced to serving as mercenaries for more powerful neighbors. Then came the moment that Mexica tradition treats as their founding miracle. Migrating priests, so the story goes, saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent, on a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Interpreting this as a sign from their patron god Huitzilopochtli, they settled there in what is traditionally dated to 1325. It was not prime real estate. The island was marshy, prone to flooding, and offered little in the way of farmland. But the Mexica turned this liability into an advantage. They built Chinampas, artificial agricultural islands constructed by piling lake mud and vegetation into rectangular plots, anchored by willow trees whose roots held the soil in place. These floating gardens became extraordinarily productive, allowing a dense population to be fed from a relatively small area. The city they built on that island, Tenochtitlan, would in time become the greatest urban center in the Americas. For roughly a century, the Mexica remained a subordinate power, paying tribute to more dominant city-states in the valley, most notably Azcapotzalco. That changed in 1428, when Tenochtitlan joined with 2 other city-states, Texcoco and Tlaxcalan, in a political and military alliance historians call the Triple Alliance. Together, they overthrew Azcapotzalco and began a systematic campaign of conquest across central Mexico. Over the following decades, the Triple Alliance, with Tenochtitlan increasingly the dominant partner, extended its reach through military force, strategic marriages, and diplomacy, eventually controlling or extracting tribute from an estimated 5 to 6 million people across a vast swath of what is now Mexico. It is worth pausing here to correct a common misconception. The polity we call the Aztec Empire was not a single centralized state in the way Rome or China were. It functioned more as a hegemonic tribute empire. Conquered city-states typically kept their own rulers and internal governance, so long as they paid regular tribute in goods, labor, and in some cases captives. This system allowed the empire to expand rapidly without the administrative burden of direct rule, but also meant that loyalty among subject peoples was often thin. Many communities resented Mexican dominance and paid tribute only because the alternative was military reprisal. That resentment would matter enormously later. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan itself was staggering in scale. Estimates among historians vary, but most place its population between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it larger than any city in Spain at the time and among the largest cities on Earth. It was built on a grid of canals, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, and fed by an aqueduct bringing fresh water from the springs at Chapultepec. At its heart stood the Templo Mayor, a massive stepped pyramid dedicated to 2 gods, Huitzilopochtli, deity of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture. Archaeological excavation of the Templo Mayor site, ongoing since the 1970s in downtown Mexico City, has confirmed much of what colonial-era accounts described about its scale and religious function. Aztec society was also intellectually and administratively sophisticated. They maintained a complex calendar system, developed extensive tribute records, ran organized marketplaces. The market at nearby Tlatelolco reportedly hosted tens of thousands of people daily, according to Spanish eyewitness accounts, trading goods from across the region, and educated children in dedicated schools, with separate institutions for commoners and nobility. Their religious practices, including the well-documented ritual of human sacrifice, were deeply embedded in their cosmology. The Mexica believed the sun required nourishment through sacrificial blood to continue its daily battle against darkness, and warfare itself was partly oriented around capturing enemy soldiers for ritual sacrifice rather than killing them outright on the battlefield. Historians continue to debate the actual scale of sacrifice. Some early Spanish accounts appear exaggerated for political purposes, while archaeological evidence, including skull racks and burial sites uncovered at the Templo Mayor, confirms the practice was real, ritually significant, and larger in scale than in most other Mesoamerican societies, even if precise numbers remain contested. By 1502, the empire was ruled by Moctezuma II, who inherited a realm at the height of its power, but also one straining under the pressures of its own success. Constant tribute demands and displays of military dominance had left many subject peoples deeply hostile to Mexica rule. This is the political landscape into which the Spanish would arrive 17 years later. Not a unified, beloved empire, but a powerful yet fractured hegemony sitting atop a foundation of resentment. In February 1519, a Spanish expedition of roughly 500 men under the command of Hernan Cortes landed on the coast of what is now Mexico. Cortes was acting partly against the authority of the Cuban governor who had commissioned the expedition, making his campaign as much a personal gamble as an official mission. What followed was one of the most consequential encounters in world history, and one that has been mythologized, distorted, and re-examined by historians for 5 centuries. The first crucial development was Cortes's alliance with the Tlaxcalans, a fiercely independent state that had successfully resisted Mexican conquest for generations and bore deep hostility toward Tenochtitlan. After initial fighting, the Tlaxcalans allied with the Spanish, providing thousands of warriors who would ultimately outnumber the Spanish forces many times over throughout the campaign. This point cannot be overstated. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was not accomplished by a few hundred Spaniards alone. It was fundamentally a war fought by a coalition of indigenous peoples, with Spanish steel, horses, and firearms serving as one component of a much larger and more complex military alliance rooted in existing regional conflicts. Cortes and his growing coalition marched toward Tenochtitlan and, in November 1519, entered the city. Moctezuma received them. The exact nature of this reception and Moctezuma's motivations remain genuinely debated among historians. Older narratives claimed Moctezuma believed Cortes might be a returning god, tied to the deity Quetzalcoatl. Most contemporary historians now treat this account with significant skepticism, noting it appears primarily in sources written after the conquest, often to serve Spanish or later indigenous political narratives, and it is unclear whether Moctezuma held any such belief at all. A more grounded explanation is that Moctezuma, uncertain of the stranger's military capabilities and political intentions, chose a strategy of cautious diplomacy, hoping to observe and manage the situation rather than risk immediate conflict. That diplomacy collapsed quickly. Within weeks, the Spanish took Moctezuma into custody within his own palace, effectively holding him hostage while ruling through him. Tensions escalated further when a subordinate Spanish commander, left in charge while Cortes was away confronting a rival Spanish force, ordered an attack on Mexican nobles during a religious festival, killing many unarmed participants. The massacre ignited open rebellion. When Cortes returned, the city had turned decisively hostile. Moctezuma, brought out to try to calm his own people, was killed in the chaos. Spanish and indigenous accounts differ on whether he died from a wound inflicted by his own outraged subjects or was killed by the Spanish themselves once he was no longer useful. This is one of the genuine, unresolved questions of the conquest. What followed was a disaster for the Spanish. On the night of June 30th, 1520, remembered in Spanish accounts as La Noche Triste, the sad night, Cortes's forces attempted to flee the city under cover of darkness. Mexica, warriors attacked them along the causeways, and hundreds of Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies drowned in the lake, weighed down by looted gold, or were killed in the fighting. It was a near-total catastrophe, and for a moment, it appeared the conquest had failed entirely. But Cortes regrouped. Over the following months, with continued support from Tlaxcala and other resentful subject states, he rebuilt his coalition. And then a factor arrived that would prove more devastating than any weapon: smallpox. The disease, unknowingly carried by an enslaved man traveling with an earlier Spanish expedition, tore through the valley of Mexico's population, which had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. Historians estimate that smallpox killed a substantial portion of Tenochtitlan's population, including the emperor who succeeded Moctezuma, Cuauhtemoc, who died of the disease after ruling for only about 80 days. The demographic and social devastation wrought by epidemic disease across the Americas in this period, smallpox and other introduced illnesses together, is regarded by most historians as the single most significant factor in the collapse of indigenous resistance across the continent, arguably more consequential than any battlefield defeat. In May 1521, Cortes returned to lay siege to Tenochtitlan itself, now commanded by the young Emperor Cuauhtemoc. The siege lasted roughly 80 days and was brutal on both sides. The Spanish and their overwhelming indigenous coalition, by this point numbering in the tens of thousands, systematically cut off the city's causeways, choked its food and water supply, and fought street by street as the defenders, weakened by disease and starvation, resisted with extraordinary tenacity. Contemporary accounts describe a city reduced to rubble, its canals choked with the dead. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtemoc was captured attempting to flee by canoe, and organized resistance collapsed. Tenochtitlan, one of the greatest cities on earth, had fallen. The aftermath was, in every sense, the end of a world. The Spanish built Mexico City directly atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan, using stones from demolished temples in the construction of churches and colonial buildings. The empire's political structure was dismantled and replaced by Spanish colonial administration. Traditional religious practices were suppressed, and a sustained, decades-long campaign of forced conversion to Christianity was carried out. Perhaps most devastatingly, waves of epidemic disease continued for decades after the conquest, and demographic studies suggest the indigenous population of central Mexico declined by somewhere between 80 and 90% over the following century, a demographic collapse with few parallels in recorded history, driven overwhelmingly by disease rather than direct violence. Though forced labor and the disruption of agricultural and social systems compounded the toll. And yet the story does not end in total erasure. Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, is still spoken by well over 1 million people in Mexico today. Elements of Aztec cuisine, art, and vocabulary are woven into modern Mexican culture and identity. The eagle devouring the serpent, the founding vision of Tenochtitlan, appears today on the flag of Mexico itself, a nation that, centuries later, would choose to root part of its national identity in the very civilization that was destroyed to make way for it. What remains, in the end, is a story that resists simple narration. It is not merely a tale of a small band of conquistadors toppling an empire through superior weapons. That framing, popular for centuries, obscures far more than it reveals. It is the story of a powerful but fractured hegemonic state, undone by the very resentments its own conquests had created, of an indigenous coalition of tens of thousands who saw an opportunity to break Mexican dominance and seized it, and of a biological catastrophe, utterly outside anyone's control or understanding at the time, that did more to determine the outcome than any army. The Aztec Empire did not simply lose a war. It was caught at the collision point of internal political fragility, a determined foreign expedition skilled at exploiting local rivalries, and a pandemic with no precedent in human history. Out of that collision, an empire fell, a new colonial order rose, and a civilization that had built one of the great cities of the world was forced to survive, not in stone and gold, but in memory, language, and the resilience of the people who endured.